Mm. Testing, testing. Can you hear me? So, oh, hello, 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 hello. Hello, hello. So, couple things before I get started. Um, since I highly doubt, um, well, I know nobody's here yet, but I'm just gonna put this in for later in case somebody's rewatching. Uh, for one, you might notice I have a new microphone. I don't know how good it is. Um, hopefully it's fine. Hopefully it's clear. Hopefully you can all hear what I'm saying. Um, recently I've been listening to some lectures from Wendy Brown about Max Weber. Uh, and also I was by happenstance assigned the vocation lectures, or at least the second vocation lecture, um as an assignment. So I figure why not just read through it? Uh, just because. Um, I always like it when I have audio versions of things, and it seems like there are no English language audio versions of the vocation lectures. So I'm just gonna motivate myself to read through it by actually reading, like out loud. Um, it's probably going to be a struggle because I'm not great at reading things out loud. I stumble over my words a lot. So I'll try to go slow, I'll try to be clear. Um, and I will probably not do the whole thing today. Um, let me actually check how much I need to be doing today. Um, um, okay. Well, I do need to be doing a good bit today, interestingly, but we'll see how long I can go before my voice gives out. Um, yeah, I'm mostly going to be reading. I might stop to take notes a couple of times or to comment. So I've read this before, but I have not read this translation before. And I've come to know that this translation is better than the one that I was reading. Um, specifically because it includes Weber's Nietzschean influences more so than uh, the first English translation of it by Talcott Parsons, I believe. So this one is by, and this translation, I mean, I can actually just check. Um, if it loads. Ronald Spears is the translator for this one. Um, so yeah, I guess let's just get started from the beginning. So, the profession and vocation of politics. And then footnote, Politik als Beruf appeared as a brochure in the series Geistig Arbeit als Beruf. I don't know. Uh, Something in German. Intellectual work as a vocation. 4 lectures on the Union of Free Students. Uh, Following the editorial change first made by Merriam-Webster in the not pronouncing this and adopted by the editors of the not pronouncing this, the 10th paragraph, all organized rule, means of administration, has been shifted from its clearly erroneous position in the first edition and certain misprints corrected. Weber's essay is based on a lecture given in Munich in January of 1919, but not published until October of that year. Here it appears after the quote President of the Reich unquote, since this article actually appeared in print first. In conception, however, the lecture is clearly the earlier piece. In the title, the term Beruf has been translated as profession and vocation because the essay deals both with the business and organization of politics and also with the inner vocation of the dedicated politician. So I want to highlight this actually because when I was listening to Wendy Brown's lecture on this, uh, it's purple. It was also apparently the case that this means uh, that it could also be translated as calling, which is meant to emphasize something more religious um, about this sort of undertaking. That it's not just about uh, professions or vocations, but about something a little bit deeper, like a deeper devotion to it. Um, and you can't see my notes, but actually, if I do that, you should be able to. Actually, hold on. Let me check something. Yes. Okay, that's fine. All right. So that's an introductory note from the translator. The lecture which I am about to get, the lecture which I am to give at your request will necessarily disappoint you in various ways. You are bound to expect a talk on the profession of politics, to take a stand on the topical questions of the day. Yet that will only happen at the end of my lecture in a purely formal way and in response to particular questions concerning the significance of political action within our conduct of life as a whole. What must be completely excluded from today's lecture, on the other hand, are all questions concerning the brand of politics one ought to practice, which is to say, the content one ought to give to one's political activity. For this has nothing to do with the general question of what the profession of politics is and what it can mean. Let us get straight down to this. Now, interestingly, I'm kind of skeptical that you can make such a clean separation. Um, that you can make a separation between the content and the general method of politics. So I'm gonna you just a question. Yellow means I'm questioning. Um, yeah. What do we understand by politics or politique? The term is an extraordinarily broad one, embracing every kind of independent leadership activity. We talk about the bank's policies on foreign exchange, the bank rate policy of the Reichsbank, the policy of a union during a strike. One can speak of the educational policy of the community in a town or village, of the policies of the management committee leading a club. And finally, we even talk about the policies of an astute wife in her efforts to guide her husband. Naturally, our reflections this evening are not based on a concept as broad as this. Today, we shall use the term only to mean the leadership or the exercise of influence on leadership of a political association, which today means a state. Yet, what is a political association considered from a sociological point of view? What is a state? This too cannot be defined sociologically in terms of the content of its activities. There is hardly a task which has not been undertaken by some political association at some time or at other, but equally there is no task of which it could have been but equally there is no task of which it could be said that it is always, far less exclusively, the preserve of those associations which are defined as political, in today's language, states, or which were the historical predecessors of the modern state. Okay, let me try to process that. Always far less exclusively the preserve. It's not been undertaken. Okay. Interesting. Interesting. In the last analysis, the modern state can only be defined sociologically in terms of a specific means which is peculiar to the state, as it is to all other political associations, namely physical violence. Quote, every state is founded on force, as Trotsky once said at Brest-Litovsk. Brest-Litovsk. That is indeed correct. If there existed only social formations in which violence was unknown as a means, then the concept of the state would have disappeared. Then that condition would have arisen, which one would define in this particular sense of the word as anarchy. Violence is, of course, not the normal or sole means used by the state. There is no question of that, but it is the means specific to the state. Okay. At the present moment, the relation between the state and the violence is a particularly intimate one. Footnote. As Weber was speaking, Germany was in the throes of the so-called German Revolution, which broke out in November 1918 and had reached a new peak of intensity in January of 1919. In Munich, where Weber was addressing these remarks to students, the Soviet Republic of Bavaria had been proclaimed. Intellectuals such as Kurt Eisner and Ernst Toller were prominently involved, prompting Weber to return yet again to the recurrent theme of the role played by literateurs in politics. Uh, is there a set reason for reading this? Two things. So for one, I've been listening to Wendy Brown's lectures on Weber, and for two, I was assigned this to read, and I haven't read this translation before. So also, your Sonic Hammer, right? Uh, just making sure I know who I know who you are. um. Anyway, in the past, the most diverse kinds of associations, beginning with the clan, have regarded physical violence as a quite normal instrument. Nowadays, by contrast, we have to say that the state is that human community which successfully lays claim to the monopoly of legitimate physical violence within a certain territory, this territory being another defining characteristic of the state. Okay, so this is important, I think, um, because this, I believe, is modern for Weber's time. The idea of the territory. Um, so like for example, in Hobbes, it's not clear that sovereignty is over a given piece of land per se, but instead that it is over subjects, basically like a people consents to 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 sovereignty, or they form the sovereign covenant among themselves, and they thus subject themselves to the rule of the sovereign. But it's not clear then how territory is inscribed from that, right? So it's yeah, all right, then I will call you Maram. I'm just making sure I understand who you are. But yeah, so this, I think, this definitely contrasts with like other understandings for sure of the state. Or And I think it's important to note that, because it seems like in a lot of discourse, especially on the state, people take this as a trans-historical definition of the state. But what he's giving here is a modern definition of the state, modern by his standards. For the specific feature of the present is that the right to use physical violence is attributed to any and all other associations or individuals only to the extent that the state, for its part, permits this to happen. The state is held to be the sole source of the quote unquote right to use violence. In our terms, then, politics would mean striving for a share of the power, or for influence on the distribution of power, whether it be between the states or between the groups of people contained within a single state. And let me just note that. Um, all right. Essentially, this corresponds to ordinary usage. If one says that a question is a political question, or that a minister or official is a political official, or that a decision is determined politically, what is meant in each case is that interests in the distribution, preservation, or transfer of power play a decisive role in answering that question, determining this decision or defining the sphere of activity of the official in question. Anyone engaged in politics is striving for power, either power as a means to attain other goals, which may be ideal or selfish, or power for its own sake, which is to say, in order to enjoy the feeling of prestige given by power. Okay. Excuse me. Just like the political associations which preceded it historically, the state is a relationship of rule by human beings over human beings, and one that rests on the legitimate use of violence, that is, violence that is held to be legitimate. For the state to remain in existence, those who are ruled must submit to the authority claimed by whoever rules at any given time. When do people do this, and why? What inner justifications and what external means support this rule? To begin with, the inner justification. There are, in principle, three grounds legitimating any rule. Firstly, there is the authority of the eternal past or custom, hallowed by the fact that it is always held sway from time immemorial and by a habitual predisposition to preserve it. So this I think is relevantly similar to what Hume basically says about political rule. Um, that it basically becomes legitimate by by manifesting it into existence. That you just kind of enforce it, and people come to accept it as legitimate just because it is uh, seen as legitimate and has been seen as legitimate. This is traditional rule, as exercised by the patriarchal and the patrimonial prince of the old type. Then there is the authority of the exceptional, personal gift of grace, or charisma, the entirely personal devotion to and personal trust in revelations, heroism, or other qualities of leadership in an individual. This is charismatic rule as exercised by the prophet, or, in the field of politics, by the chosen warlord or the plebiscitarian ruler, the great demagogue and leader of a political party. And this is an interesting one because I wanted to look at this as well because it's kind of interesting uh how Weber sees charisma, right? Because he talks about demagoguery, or the idea of the prophet, um, and like this absolute devotion to a person. Um, but it's unclear like how and when he sees this as good or bad, at least in my previous readings. Um, and I guess like because to me, in the modern context, the idea of the charismatic authority is seen as inherently it's seen with suspicion. But but Weber saw it as potentially uh revolutionary, or potentially being able to break political nihilism, or the steel casing or the iron cage or whatever else. Finally, there is rule by virtue of legality, by virtue of the belief in the validity of legal statute and the appropriate juridical competence founded on rationally devised rules. This type of rule rests on a predisposition to fulfill one's statutory obligations obediently. This is basically like liberalism, I guess. It is rule of the kind exercised by the modern servant of the state and all those bearers of power who resemble him in this respect. It goes without saying that submission of the ruled is in reality determined by a very great extent, not only by motives of fear and hope, fear of revenge from magical powers or from the holder of power, hope of reward in this life or in the hereafter, but also by interests of the most diverse kinds. We shall return to this point shortly. But when one asks what are the reasons legitimating their submission, one does indeed encounter these three pure types. These notions of legitimacy and their inner justifications are of very considerable importance for the structure of rule. Admittedly, the pure types are rarely found in reality, but it is not possible today to go into the extremely intricate variants, transitional forms, and combinations of these pure types in detail. That is a problem for a general science of the state. There's a footnote. Weber was very much influenced by the work of his colleague G. Jelinek. Jelinek? I'm not sure. Particularly by his Allgemeine Staatsliteratur, General Theory or Science of the State, Berlin, 1900. Here, we are interested above all in the second of the three types, rule by virtue of devotion to the purely personal charisma of the leader on the part of those who obey him. For this is where the idea of vocation, Beruf, in its highest form has its root. And again, better translated as calling, at least according to Wendy Brown. Devotion to the charisma of the prophet or the warlord or the exceptional demagogue in the ecclesia, The ecclesia was the assembly of all free citizens in the city-states of the ancient Greece. Okay. Um, Devotion to the charisma of the prophet or the warlord or the exceptional demagogue in the ecclesia or in parliament means that the leader is personally regarded as someone who is inwardly called to the task of leading men, and that the led submit to him, not because of custom or statute, but because they believe in him. Of course, he himself, provided he is something more than an ephemeral, narrow, and vain upstart, lives for his cause, aspires after his work. Footnote: the phrase tractet nach seinem Werke, I'm not sure, probably alludes to words spoken by Nietzsche's Zarathustra at the beginning of The Honey Offering. Quote, "For long I have not aspired after happiness. I aspire after my work." Thus spoke Zarathustra, translated by R.J. Hollingdale. Hmm. But yeah, so this is what I mean is that by the calling, it's somebody who is called to politics, and it's not somebody who is necessarily or like for them to be a good political leader or to be a good political actor in general, they can't be in it for the quote unquote ephemeral, narrow, and vain upstart. Like they can't be that, right? So I think that's important and easily missed because it shows that Weber isn't necessarily talking about someone like a Donald Trump, for example, because the an ephemeral, narrow, and vain upstart is more or less just what Donald Trump is. Donald Trump is not devoted to the cause of politics. He's not he doesn't in any way aspire after his work. So he I think Weber would say he's vested with charismatic authority in in the way that people adhere to him, but it's not the case that he's a good political actor. Like Weber would not endorse someone like Donald Trump as a political actor. At least not by my reading. Anyway, of course, he himself, provided he is something more than an ephemeral, narrow, and vain upstart, lives for his cause, aspires after his work, whereas the devotion of his adherents, be they disciples or liegemen, or his quite personal partisan supporters, is focused on his person and his qualities. So this is interesting to me because people like to focus um on Trump's qualities or his person, but they don't actually correctly assess what his personage is. I get rather his supporters don't, right? So it's interesting here how he talks about this because there is a focus here, but it's not on an actual person, but the imagined person that the populace is uh projecting onto Donald Trump. Leadership has emerged throughout the world and in all historical periods, the most important embodiments of it in the past being the magician and prophet on the one hand, and the chosen warlord, gang leader, or condottiere on the other. In the Western world, however, we find something quite specific which concerns us more directly, namely political leadership. Firstly, in the figure of the free demagogue, who grew from the soil of the city state, a unique creation of the West and of the Mediterranean culture in particular. And then in the figure of the parliamentary party leader, who also sprang from the soil of the constitutional state, another institution indigenous only to the West. Of course, nowhere is it the case that these politicians, by virtue of a vocation, in the truest sense of the word, are the only figures who carry weight in the machinery of the political power struggle. Excuse me. Of quite decisive importance is the kind of resources they have at their disposal. How do the powers who rule politically set about the task of asserting themselves as rulers? The question applies to every kind of rule, and thus also to all forms of political rule, to the traditional type as much as to the legal and charismatic types. All organized rule which demands continuous administration requires, on the one hand, that human action should rest on a disposition to obey these rulers who claim to be the bearers of legitimate force, and on the other hand, that thanks to this obedience, the latter should have at their command the material resources necessary to exercise physical force if circumstances should demand it. Okay, I'm going to reread that. All organized rule which demands continuous administration requires, on the one hand, that human action should rest on a disposition to obey those rulers who claim to be the bearers of legitimate force, and on the other, that thanks to this obedience, the latter should have at their command the material resources necessary to exercise physical force if circumstances should demand it. So it's basically like they're mutually co-constitutive of one another is what I'm getting from this. In other words, it requires an administrative staff and the material means of administration. As in any other organization, the administrative staff, which is the outward organizational form taken by political rule, is of course not bound in obedience to the holder of power solely by the notion of legitimacy, which we have just been discussing. It is also bound by two means which appeal to self interest: material reward and social honor. The fiefs of vassals, the prebends of the patrimonial office of that. Let me restart that. The fiefs of vassals, the prebends of patrimonial officials, the salary of the modern civil servant, or chivalric honor, the privileges of a particular social estate, the official's honor. These are the rewards, and it is the fear of losing them which forms the ultimate decisive basis for the solidarity of the administrative staff with the holder of power. Interesting. So it's interesting that he locates it in the fear of losing them and not in the prospect of gaining them, which is actually kind of a common theme throughout a lot of what I've read in like political writings, is the idea that deprivation hurts more psychologically than reward pleases. This is something that's echoed in Machiavelli as well, that like mostly what people want is to maintain their way of living and not necessarily to gain more. Um, yeah. The same applies to rule by the charismatic leader, for the military following expects booty and war honors, while the following of the demagogue expects spoils. And there's a footnote for that. Spoils is in English. Interesting. Okay. The exploitation of the ruled through the monopoly of public offices, profits tied to political power, and prizes to satisfy their vanity. In exactly the same way as in an economic organization, certain outward material goods are needed to uphold any rule by force. All forms of the state order can be divided into two main categories based on different principles. In the first, the staff of men, be they officials or whatever, on whose obedience the holder of power must be able to rely, own the means of administration in their own right, whether these consist of money, buildings, war materials, carriage parks, horses, or whatever. Interesting. All forms of the. I'm going to reread that. In the first place, the staff of men, be they officials or whatever, on whose obedience the holder of power must be able to rely, own the means of administration in their own right, whether these consist of money, buildings, war materials, carriage parks, horses, or whatever. So this is the first form. Yes, that makes sense. And this is characteristic of like uh especially of like feudal arrangements, right? Where the king um the king doesn't the king has a standing army, but a lot of what happens is that there are smaller lords with their own armies, and they come to the defense of the king when necessary, but the king himself doesn't own the uh the uh the means of administration. But the lords do. In the other case, the administrative staff is separated from the means of administration in just the same way as the office worker or proletarian of today is separated from the material means of production within a capitalist enterprise. And then this is the other important part, which is basically what he wants to say is characteristic of the modern state, I believe, is this arrangement where, if you think about a bureaucracy, you're never spending your own money. You're never using your own resources personally. It's always the money of the organization. You know, um, the like the Secret Service is not loyal to the president per se, or the president as a person, but they're loyal to the president as an office, right? Um, the army is not loyal to any one person; it's that's loyal to the country, and so there isn't like this strict sense in which any one person within the state actually owns any of the administrative resources. Um, the It's distributed. Hmm, Sorry, I need to check something. Just got a notification, so I need to check something. Sorry. Okay, I just needed to check that. Sorry. Yeah. Anyway, thus, it is a question of whether the holder of power controls the administration personally and directly, having the actual administrative work done by the personal servants or by paid officials or by personal favorites and confidants, none of whom are proprietors, owners in their own right, of the material means of operation, but who work rather under the direction of the ruler, or whether the opposite is the case. This difference runs through all the administrative organizations of the past. Hmm. Ah, yeah. So it's interesting. So it's interesting though because he does seem to imply the holder of power controls the administration personally and directly by having the actual administrative work done by personal servants or by paid officials or by personal favorites and confidants, none of whom are proprietors, owners in their own right of the material means of operation, but who work rather under the direction of the ruler. So the question is like for me in this case is does the ruler also not own them? Or rather, should they it seems like we shouldn't characterize uh the holder of power as uh controlling directly all of these things, right? Um because it seems like in the modern state, unless you have a dictator, um neither one of these prevails really. But I could be just misreading here. We shall apply the term association structured by estates to political associations in which the dependent administrative staff have complete or partial control in their own right over the material means of administration. Yeah. So this is what I mean, like by the feudal arrangement, is that it's divided into estates. The vassal in a feudal association, for example, paid out of his own purse the cost of administration and jurisdiction in the district for which he held the fief. He also paid for his own equipment and provisions in wartime. The vassals subject to him did the same in their turn. Naturally, his had consequences for the lord's position of power, which rested only on a bound of personal loyalty and on the fact that the feudal tenure and the social honor of the vassal derived their legitimacy from the lord. Yet everywhere, stretching back to the earliest political formations, we also find the lord in direct control of the means of administration. Through people who are personally dependent on the lord, slaves, domestic officials, servants, personal favorites, and prebendaries rewarded in money or in kind from his own stores, he seeks to gain direct control of the administration, to pay for the means from his own purse out of the revenues from his patrimonial estates, and to create an army dependent solely on his person, equipped and provisioned from his granaries, stores, and armories. Whereas the lord in an association of estates rules with the help of an autonomous aristocracy and the shares rule with the aristocracy, here his rule rests either on members of his household or on plebeians, strata of society who lack possessions or social honor of their own, and who are entirely changed to him in material terms, having no power of their own to compete with his. All forms of patriarchal and patrimonial rule, sultanic despotism, and the bureaucratic state order belong to this type. This is especially true of the bureaucratic state order, that is to say, the order which, in its most rational form, is specifically characteristic of the modern state. So it seems like I'm correct in saying that it does apply to that, but I am a little puzzled, I guess, because the ruler of political power still it seems, separated from it in the same way that the people who carry it out are separated from it. Um, so I'm not sure. I'm not sure about that. The development of the modern state is set in motion everywhere by a decision of the prince to dispossess the independent private bearers of administrative power who exist alongside him. That is, all those in personal possessions, in personal possession of the means of administration and the conduct of war, the organization of finance, and the politically deployable goods of all kinds. The whole process is a complete parallel to the development of the capitalist enterprise through the gradual expropriation of the independent producers. So basically, he's talking about like an enclosure movement um, on the state level. In the end, we see that in the modern state, the power to command the entire means of political organization is in fact concentrated in a single pinnacle of power, so that there is no longer even a single official left who personally owns the money he expends or the buildings, supplies, tools, or machines of war over which he has control. So then the question, I guess, is um who is the single pinnacle of power? Because to me, it doesn't seem like in a lot of cases there. Excuse me. It doesn't seem to me that in a lot of cases there is one single pinnacle of power. Um, at least not in the bureaucratic state. So, like for the United States, right? Like the president isn't the single pinnacle of power because the president doesn't directly control all of the administrative authority, and he has to abide by the juridical codes. So I'm not 100% sure on this one. Thus, in today's state, and this is fundamental to the concept, the separation of the material means of administration from the administrative staff, the officials and employees of the administration, has been rigorously implemented. At this point, the most modern development of all begins, for we are now witnessing the attempt to bring about the expropriation of this expropriator of the means of politics, and hence of political power itself. This much the revolution has achieved, at least to the extent that leaders have taken the place of the legally established authorities and, through usurpation or election, have gained the power of command over the political staff and the material apparatus, deriving their legitimacy, with what justification is irrelevant, from the will of the ruled. It is quite another question whether, on the basis of this at least apparent success, they may justifiably hope to carry out the process of expropriation within capitalist businesses, the management of which, at its innermost core, obeys laws which, despite extensive analogies, are quite different from those obtained in the sphere of political administration. I shall not take a position on this question today. For the purpose of our deliberations, I wish only to establish that the purely conceptual grounds as follows. The modern state is an institutional association of rule which has successfully established the monopoly of physical violence as a means of rule within a territory, for which purpose it unites in the hands of its leaders the material means of operation, having expropriated all those functionaries of estates who previously had command over these things in their own right, and has put itself in the person of its highest embodiment in their place. So it's interesting. So it's in the person of its highest embodiment. So the thing is that who is that person, right? That's I think what's puzzling me. Now, in the course of this process of political expropriation, which has now taken place in all countries of the world with varying degrees of success, there emerged, in the service of the princes in the first instance, the earliest categories of professional politicians, in a second sense. These were people who did not want to be lords themselves, as charismatic leaders did. Rather, they entered the service of political lords. Rather, they entered the service of political lords. They placed themselves at the disposal of the prince in his political struggle and made the procurement of the prince's policies into a way of earning their material living on the one hand, and, on the other, into an ideal content for their own lives. Again, it is only in the West that this type of professional politician is also to be found in the service of powers other than the princes alone. In the past, they were more in the past, they were their most important instruments of power and political expropriation. Before examining the matter more closely, it's not about anything, Omega Falcon. I'm just reading. Because there's no English language reading of this uh piece. And I just felt like reading it. So before examining the matter more closely, we need to be absolutely clear about what the existence of such professional politicians entails. One can engage in politics, which means striving to influence the distribution of power between and within political formations, both as an occasional politician and as a full or part time professional politician, in exactly the same way as one earns a living in the economic sphere. We are all occasional politicians when we post our ballot slips or express our will in some similar way, such as voicing approval or protest at a political meeting, making a political speech, and so on. And for many people, this is the entire extent of their involvement in politics. Today, the part time politicians are, for example, all those local political agents and committee members of political. Nah, let me restart that. Today, the part time politicians are, for example, all those local political agents and committee members of party political associations who, as a rule, only carry out this activity if circumstances require it. and who do not chiefly, quote, live from, unquote, this activity, either in a material or in an ideal sense. The same applies to those members of councils of state and similar advisory bodies who only carry out this function when summoned to do so. It is true also of quite broad sections of our members of parliament who only engage in politics during the parliamentary session. Excuse me. In the past, such strata were to be found particularly amongst the estates. By estates, we mean the owners in their own right of the military resources or of important material means of administration or of personal powers of rule and jurisdiction. Many of these people certainly did not devote their lives completely or predominantly, or indeed more than occasionally, to the service of politics. Rather, they used their lordly power for the purpose of extracting rents or even profit, and they only became politically active in the service of the political association when this particularly demanded of them by when it was particularly demanded of them by their lord or the members of their estate. The same applies to some of okay. The same applies to some of those assistants whom the prince called on to help him in the struggle to create a political organization of his own, one that would be exclusively at his disposal. The domestic counselors, and there's a footnote here, the reference is to the counselors who did not live at court and who only took part in meetings of the prince's councils when it met in their own area. Okay. The domestic counselors, and going still further back in time, a considerable section of the counselors who assembled in the Curia, the Curia Regis, was an assembly which met wherever the king was in residence. A considerable section of the counselors who assembled in the Curia and in the prince's other advisory bodies were of this kind. But such occasional or part-time assistance was, of course, insufficient to meet the prince's needs. He had to try to create a staff of assistants devoted wholly and exclusively to his service as their principal occupation. The structure of the emergent dynastic political formation, and indeed the entire character of the culture in question, very largely depended on the sources from which he drew such assistance. The need to do this was felt above all in those political associations which constituted themselves politically as so-called free commonwealths through the complete abolition or extensive restriction of princely power. Free, not in the sense of freedom from rule by force, but in the sense of the absence, as the exclusive source of all authority, of princely power legitimated by tradition, and mostly consecrated by religion. Such formations certainly had their historical origins in the West, and the germ from which they developed was the city as a political association. The city first emerged in this role in the cultural sphere of the Mediterranean. What did the full-time politician look like in all of these cases? You gotta stop to get a drink. There are two ways of making a vocation or profession out of politics. Either one lives for politics or one lives from politics. The antithesis is by no means an exclusive one. Generally, one does both, at least spiritually and usually also in material terms. Anyone who lives for politics, quote, makes this his life, unquote, in an inward sense, either enjoying the naked possession of the power he exercises or feeding his inner balance and self-esteem from the sense that he is giving his life meaning and purpose by devoting it to the cause. In this inward sense, probably every serious-minded person who lives for a cause also lives from this cause. The distinction thus applies to a much more weighty aspect of the matter, namely the economic aspect. The person who lives from politics is one who strives to make it into an enduring source of income, whereas this does not apply to the person who lives for politics. For anyone to be able to live for politics in this economic sense, certain, if you like, very trivial, sorry, let me restart that. For anyone to be able to live for politics in this economic sense, certain, if you like, very trivial conditions must obtain wherever the order of private property prevails. Under normal circumstances, such a person must be economically independent of the income politics can give him. Yeah, yeah. Let me redo that. Under normal circumstances, such a person must be economically independent of the income politics can give him. This means, quite simply, that he must be wealthy or have private means which yield an income from which he can live. Interesting. At least this is the case under normal circumstances. Admittedly, the following of the warlord is as little concerned with the conditions of normal economic life as is the following of the revolutionary hero on the streets. Both live from booty, robbery, confiscations, levies, and impositions of worthless compulsory forms of currency, all of which essentially amount to the same thing. Necessarily, however, such conditions are outside the everyday run of things. In normal economic life, only private means can fulfill this function. Mm. Excuse me. Yet this alone is not sufficient. In addition, the politician must be economically dispensable or available, which means that his income must not depend on the fact that he personally and constantly devotes all or most of his productive energy and thought to the task of earning a living. The person who is most unconditionally dispensable in this sense is the rentier, that is, someone whose income is entirely unearned, whether, as in the case of a lord of the manor in the past, or of large landowners and the higher aristocracy in the present, this income is derived from ground rents. In the ancient world and during the Middle Ages, there were also rents for slaves and serfs, or whether it comes from or whether it comes from um, yeah, or whether it comes from securities or similar modern sources of investment income. Neither the worker nor, a fact of great importance, the entrepreneur, and particularly the modern large scale entrepreneur, is able to make himself available in this sense. The entrepreneur, in particular, is tied to his business and is not dispensable. This applies very much more to the industrial or commercial entrepreneur than to the agricultural entrepreneur, given the seasonal nature of agricultural work. It is usually very difficult for the entrepreneur to allow. Excuse me. It is usually very difficult for the entrepreneur to allow anyone to deputize him, even temporarily. The same applies to doctors, for example, and the more eminent and busier a doctor is, the less easy it is for him to absent himself from his work. Things are easier for the advocate for technical reasons connected to the organization of his work, who, for his very reason, has played an incomparably greater role as a professional politician, indeed, often a dominant one. Rather than pursue this casuistry, um, okay, Weber often refers to his clarification of conceptual distinctions as casuistry, chapter 1 of the Economy and Society. Okay. Let me get back to that. Rather than pursue this casuistry any further, let us consider some of the consequences of this state of affairs. If a state or party is led by people who, in the economic sense of the word, live exclusively for politics and not from politics, this necessarily means that the leading political strata are recruited on a plutocratic basis. Admittedly, this does not also entail the converse, namely that the plutocratic leadership meant that the leading political strata did not also strive to live from politics by exploiting their political rule to the benefit of their private economic interests. There is, of course, no question of that. There has never been a social stratum which did not do this in one way or the other. It means simply that such professional politicians are not obliged to seek recompense directly for their political work, as anyone without means is bound to do. Nor does it mean that politicians without a private fortune are merely or chiefly concerned with providing for themselves by means of politics, and that they are not, or not chiefly, concerned with the cause. Nothing could be less correct. We know from experience that a man of property makes provisions for his economic security a cardinal point in his whole conduct of life, whether consciously or unconsciously. Unconstrained and unconditional political idealism is to be found, if not exclusively, then at least to an unusual degree, precisely in those strata whose lack of means places them outside of the circle of those who have an interest in preserving the economic order of a particular society. This is particularly the case during out of the ordinary. Let me get a drink. This is particularly the case during out of the ordinary, which is to say revolutionary periods. Rather, it means simply this: that any non-plutocratic recruitment of those with interests in politics, the leadership, and its following is tied to the self-evident condition that the business of politics must produce a regular and reliable income for such people. Politics can either be conducted on an honorary basis, which means by so-called independent, and that is wealthy people, above all those with unearned income, or access to political leadership can be given to people without private means, in which case it has to be remunerated. The professional politician living from politics can be a pure prebendary or a salaried official. Either he draws an income from charges and fees for particular yeah. Jesus. Probably gonna stop soon because my voice is starting to give out, but gonna keep going. Keep powering through. Yeah. Either he draws in an income from charges and fees for particular services, gratuities and bribes are only an irregular and formally illegal variant of this category of income, or he draws a fixed remuneration in kind or a salary in money, or a combination of both. He can assume the character of an entrepreneur, like the condottiere or the holder of a leased or purchased office in the past, or like the American boss who regards his expenses as a capital investment from which he will derive a yield by exploiting his influence. And there's a footnote. Weber uses the word boss here and in the rest of the essay in its American sense. Or he can draw a fixed wage, as does an editor or party secretary or a modern minister of political official. In the past, fiefs, grants of land, benefices of all kinds, but above all, once a money economy had developed, fee-yielding prebends, these were the typical forms of recompense paid to their following by princes, victorious conquerors, or successful party leaders. Nowadays, the rewards bestowed by party leaders for faithful service are offices of all kinds in parties, newspapers, cooperatives, medical insurance schemes, municipalities, and states. All clashes between parties are not only conflicts about substantive goals, they are also, and above all, struggles for the patronage of office. All the conflicts between particularist and centralist ambitions in Germany also revolve around the question of which powers are to control the patronage of office, whether it is to be the powers in Berlin or in Munich, in Karlsruhe or in Dresden. Any diminution of their share of the offices available for distribution is felt by the parties to be a graver loss than actions directed against their substantive goals. Interesting. Hold on. I'm going to highlight that. In France, a large-scale change in the party political prefecture was always considered to be a greater upheaval and generated more hubbub than a modification in the government's program, since this meant little more than a change of wording. Some parties, and notably those in America, since the disappearance of the old conflicts about the interpretation of the Constitution, have become simply parties of position seekers which change their substantive program according to the chances of winning votes. Until very recently in Spain, where elections were manufactured from above, the two major parties simply had an agreement to govern by turns so as to provide offices for their following. In the Spanish colonies, all so called elections and all so called revolutions are always concerned with the state trough at which the winners wish to be fed. In Switzerland, the parties divide the offices peacefully amongst themselves according to the principle of proportionality, and a number of revolutionary draft constitutions here in Germany, for example, the first one proposed for Baden, I'm not sure, sought to extend this system to ministerial offices, thus treating the state and its offices simply as an institution for the provisioning of prebendaries. The Center Party, in particular, was enthusiastic about this proposal, even making it an item in its manifesto that in Biden, uh, even making it an item in its manifesto that in Baden, offices should be distributed proportionally according to religious confession, which is to say, regardless of achievement. This tendency is growing amongst all parties, and in the eyes of their following, the parties are increasingly regarded as a means to the end of being provided for in this way. The growth of this tendency is connected with the growth in the number of offices as consequences of general bureaucratization and with the growing appetite for such offices as a form of specifically assured provision. Eh. There is, however, a countervailing tendency to all this in the development of modern officialdom into a body of intellectual workers highly qualified in their specialty by long years of preparatory training and with a highly developed sense of professional honor, which puts a premium on integrity. Uh, Without this sense of professional honor, it would be our fate to have hovering over us the permanent threat of terrible corruption and base Philistinism. Just a second. This would also threaten the purely technical performance of the state apparatus, which has grown steadily in its importance for the economy and will continue to grow, especially with increasing socialization. In the United States, where professional officials with lifelong tenure were once unknown, amateur administration by booty politicians meant that hundreds of thousands? Hold on. In the United States, where professional officials with lifelong tenure were once unknown, amateur administration by booty politicians meant that hundreds of thousands of officials, right down to the postman, changed office as a result of the outcome of the presidential election. This system has long since been punctured by the civil service reform. And it's interesting, this might be undone kind of soon, where because like that's what Trump is trying to do right now is undo this whole thing and basically make it return us to this situation where uh you can just basically fill every office of the administrative state with cronies. Purely technical, compelling exigencies of administration have determined this development. In Europe, the division of official labor into specialist areas of competence is a development which has taken place gradually over a period of 500 years. It began in the Italian cities and signori. Weber discusses the signori in Economy and Society. They were, in Weber's view, the first political power in Western Europe to introduce rational administration by officials who were increasingly appointed. Interesting. It began in the Italian cities and signori, while the first monarchies to take this course were the states of the Norman conquerors. The decisive step was taken in the area of the prince's finances. One can see from the administrative reforms of the Euro. Just a second. One can see from the administrative reforms of the Emperor Max how difficult it was, even under the pressure of the direst necessity and Turkish rule, for officials to dispossess the prince in this area, although this was the sphere which could least tolerate the amateurism of a ruler who at the time was still, first and foremost, a knight. Um, Let me look at this real quick. So Maximilian the First, okay, is who Max is. Um, the development of the technique of warfare gave rise to the specialist officer. The refinement of legal processes did the same for the trained lawyer. In all three areas, specialized officialdom was finally victorious in the more advanced states in the 16th century. Thereby, two simultaneous processes were initiated: the rise of princely absolutism vis-a-vis the estates, and the prince's gradual abdication of personal rule to the specialist officials to whom he owed his victory over the estates in the first place. Yes. So this is interesting because this is what exactly what I was talking about, is that even if the power is vested in the highest office, it seems like it's still ultimately in the hands of the professionals, even though these professionals don't own the administrative state. Simultaneously, with the rise of professionally trained officialdom, there came about the development of the leading politicians, albeit by much more gradual stages. Actually, should I stop here? Okay, I'm at 322. Where do I need to be, like, by tomorrow? I need to get to. Okay, I would have like 12 more pages. I don't know if my voice can handle that. I was on 22. Is Max Weber someone I agree with generally? That's a good question. Weber has influenced my political thought a lot, but I don't know that it's hard to say because, like, I think that on the one hand, he's been super influential to me in trying to understand the uh the state bureaucracy, um, or just bureaucracy in general, and why it's like so special, and why it's so hard to break things in the bureaucracy. Um, that it's kind of like this rationalization of power such that it can be optimally delegated. Um, and in that sense, I am very admiring of Weber. But on the other hand, I'm not so hmm, what is the what's the word? I'm not so with him on the idea of like the absolute separation of politics from the sciences or the activity of knowledge, because it's that was one of the main things for Weber, is that he saw the influence of politics in knowledge, in science, not just the hard sciences, but any kind of knowledge, or calling of knowledge, as being uh necessarily like degrading to it in some way, and that it was the role of uh the purveyor of knowledge is to be apolitical in some sense. um and I feel like it feels impossible for me that is the case. um I would For more elaboration on that, I would recommend Wendy Brown's second lecture on Weber. um it's like politics in nihilistic times, thinking with Max Weber. uh there are two lectures of that on YouTube. The second one is mostly where she talks about this question of science as a vocation. And I'm also just like, I'm not sure I agree. Reading this, I'm not sure I understand what he's saying with respect to like the distribution or the deprivation of officials from administrative power, right? Because my feeling is that it should apply all the way down. That that in the bureaucracy there is no single person, not even the highest office, that direct has any kind of direct control over the means of administration. No one owns the state in the bureaucracy. It's all like massively distributed throughout the bureaucratic network. But it seems to me like Weber is saying that there's a kind of absolutism in the bureaucratization of things. And I'm not sure how to square that. But I could be wrong. Let's go just a little bit longer. I hope that answered your question, DS Zero. Um, Simultaneously with the rise of professionally trained officialdom, there came about the development of the leading politicians, albeit by much more gradual stages. Of course, throughout the world, there had always existed advisors to the princes whose word was in fact decisive. In the Orient, the typical figures of the Grand Vizier was created out of a need to exonerate the Sultan as far as possible from personal responsibility for the success of government. In the West, diplomacy first became a consciously cultivated art during the reign of Charles V, the age of Machiavelli, particularly under the influence of the reports from the Venetian legates, which were read with passionate interest in specialist diplomatic circles. The adepts of this art, most of them with a humanist training, treated one another as a specially educated stratum of initiates, much like the Chinese statesmen with humanist training during the last period of the Warring States. So there's a footnote here. The period of the Warring States was the period 475 to 221 BCE. Weber's account of the nature of the Chinese state can be found in the essays translated under the title "The Religion of China: Confucianism and Taoism." Interesting. Hmm. Yes. So, the necessity for a leading statesman to give formally unified leadership to the entire policy of a government, including domestic policy, only came about finally and compellingly as a result of the constitutional developments. Until then, there had, of course, always been individuals who advised, or in fact actually led, the princes. but the organization of the administrative authorities had initially followed other paths, even in the most advanced states. The highest administrative authorities had been founded on the collegial principle. Footnote: the concept of collegiality is discussed in Economy and Society, Chapter 3, Section 8. A contemporary example cited by Weber is the power of the German revolutionary councils of workers and soldiers to countersign official decrees. In theory, and to a gradually diminishing degree in practice, their meetings were presided over personally by the prince who gave the decision. The prince, finding himself increasingly in the position of an amateur, attempted to free himself from the inevitably growing weight of the official's specialist training and to keep supreme leadership in his own hands by means of his collegial system, which led to expert opinions, counter opinions, and reasoned votes of the majority and minority, but also by surrounding himself with purely personal confidants, the cabinet, alongside the official highest authorities. He would then let his decisions be known via these confidants in response to the resolutions of the Council of State, or whatever else the highest state authority was called. Yes. So the council is the highest authority. Interesting. This latent struggle between professional officialdom and the autocratic rule existed everywhere. The situation only changed with the advent of parliaments and the aspirations of their party leaders to power. Yet the same outward result was produced by very varied sets. Jesus Christ. Yet the same outward result was produced by very varied sets of underlying conditions. Admittedly, there were certain differences. Wherever dynasties kept a hold on real power, as was the case in Germany in particular, the interests of the prince were now joined in solidarity with those of the officials against Parliament and its claims of power. It was in the interest of the officials that the leading, which is to say ministerial posts, should be filled from their ranks. Or, in other words, that such posts should be goals to which officials could aspire by the process of promotion. The monarch, for his part, had an interest in being able to nominate ministers as he thought fit from the ranks of the officials dedicated to his service. But both monarch and officials were interested in ensuring the political leadership presented a united, closed front to Parliament, which means that they both had an interest in the replacement of the collegial system by a unitary chief of cabinet. Furthermore, simply in order to remain above party struggles and party attacks in a purely formal sense, the monarch needed a responsible individual to give him cover, which meant someone who would confront and be answerable to Parliament and who would deal with the parties. With all these interests pulling in the same direction, there came into being an official minister who provided unified leadership. There's a footnote here. The term Beamtenminister is an unusual one. Presumably, it means the minister responsible for the civil service. Okay. Interesting. The development of parliamentary power generated an even stronger impulse towards unitary leadership in places where, as in England, parliamentary power gained the upper hand over the monarch. Here, the cabinet, headed by the single parliamentary chief or leader, developed as a committee of that power which, although ignored by official laws, was in fact the sole decisive political power, namely the party currently in possession of a majority. Okay. Let me make sure. Yeah. So what's the leader is in English. Interesting. The official collegial bodies were not, as such, organs of the power which really exercised rule, that is, the party. Therefore, they could not be the bearers of real government. what a ruling party needed in order to assert its power in domestic politics and to conduct high politics in relation to other countries was an effective organ, meeting in confidence and composed exclusively of the men who truly led the party. In other words, a cabinet. But it also needed a leader responsible for all decisions to the public, and especially to the public in parliament, namely as a head of cabinet. This English system was then adopted on the continent in the form of parliamentary ministers, parliamentary ministries, rather. Only in America and in the democracies influenced by America was a quite different system developed in direct contrast to the English one. Here, the chosen leader of the victorious party, elected by direct popular vote, was placed at the head of an apparatus of officials whom he nominated. He was tied to parliamentary approval only in budgetary and legislative matters. Yes. The development of politics into an organization which demanded training in this struggle for power and its methods, as it has been developed by the modern party system, resulted in the division of public functionaries into two clearly, although not absolutely, distinct categories: specialists, professional officials on the one hand, and political officials on the other. The political officials, in the truest sense of the word, are outwardly recognizable by the fact that they can be transferred or dismissed at will at any time, or at any rate sent into temporary retirement. Excuse me. As in the case of the French prefects and the officials of the same type in other countries, in sharp contradistinction to the independence of officials whose function is a judicial one. And again, this boundary is kind of breaking down. In England, this category includes officials who, in accordance with established convention, leave office whenever there is a change or parliamentary majority, and thus of the cabinet. In particular, the officials who tend to belong to this category are those whose area of responsibility includes the general administration of home affairs. The political component of this responsibility consists above all in the task of maintaining law and order in the country, which is to say, upholding the existence of the existing relations of rule. Let me reread that. In particular, the officials who tend to belong to this category are those whose area of responsibility includes the general administration of home affairs. Yeah, so this is the independent official. As prescribed by Putkheimer's edict, which is to say the minister of the Interior of Prussia, Putkheimer initiated a reform of the civil service. In January 1882, a royal edict announced that officials were bound by their oath of office to support government policy. Yeah. As prescribed by Putkheimer's edict, these officials had the duty in Prussia, on pain of being disciplined, to, quote, represent the policy of the government, unquote, and were used, like the prefects in France, as an official apparatus to influence elections. Under the German systems, admittedly, and in contrast to those to other countries, most political officials shared the same quality as all other officials, in that these political offices, too, could only be attained on the basis of academic study, professional examination, and a defined period of preparatory service. In Germany, only ministers, the head of the political apparatus, lack this specific characteristic of modern professional official. Under the old regime, it was possible to become Prussian Minister of Culture without ever having attended an institution of higher learning, whereas it was only possible for a candidate to become Vortragender. What does that mean? The head of the administration section of the Foreign Office, who reported to a higher level. Okay. On the strict condition that he had taken the prescribed examinations. The Dezernent, which is to say the head of a division in a ministry, with his and the Vortragender Rat, with his professional training, was of course infinitely better informed about the real technical problems in his specialist area than his chief. As for example, when Althoff headed the Prussian Ministry of Education. And then what is this referencing? Althoff is an academic turned civil servant who was responsible for higher education policy in Prussia from 1882 to 1907. This period was marked by both expansion and ministerial interference. Weber's attitude to and dealings with the Althoff system are available on Max Weber on Universities, the power of the state and the dignity of the academic calling in Imperial Germany. The situation was no different in England. Consequently, the official who was also the more powerful figure as regards all day-to-day needs. There was nothing inherently nonsensical about this arrangement. The minister was, after all, the representative of the political power constellation, and his task was to represent its political criteria and to test the proposals of the specialist officials under him against those criteria, or to give them appropriate directives of a political kind. And I will be stopping there. My voice is starting to give out. Actually, can I just bookmark? Is there a bookmark? No, there isn't. Um. All right. I don't know if that was interesting to anybody but me, but thank you all for coming. I will talk to you later.